So I'm looking forward to learning, Jason. So thank you for presenting for all of us. And to the group, we've made it halfway. So just keep on plugging, and hopefully you'll get the whole book read and be ready to consider testing down the road. So with no further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Jason. And I guess just one last thought though, too. We're all just learning together, and we have some of the most amazing presenters. So just remember, just read the book, and you don't have to be too overwhelmed. It's a whole career of learning in front of us. So this is the beginning. So anyway, Jason, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Donna. I haven't presented in this format before, so let me know if there's anything you guys can't hear me. Hopefully internet connection stays stable here. I'm in my office, it's a little distracted. I'll apologize in advance if I get a couple of barge in moments, but I'll do my best here. Great, what you were saying. It's really good to keep this kind of light and keep open, and you can't remember everything. And hopefully, I've done this presentation before in different settings, and to try to get concepts understood and why things are. You don't have to remember every term. You can do that in books. So I'm here as a resource to try to help you guys pass the test, but also ask questions. I've got a lot of slides. I'm going to go through some of them quicker than others. It's a lot of chapters to cover in 2 hours. It's crazy. If somebody has a question, push the raise your hand button. I'll be happy to help. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. And I'm just going to let you know what I think about all these concepts, and hopefully it comes together into something that helps you guys learn. So all this stuff that I've put together is really stuff that you may find questions on. It's all from study guides, it's from old tests, it's from some of the terminology and definitions that will often show up on tests. So pretty much if there's a slide here, there's some correlation to something you're probably going to be expected to know. What is a tree? There's a definition of tree that Alex Shigo, who we'll talk about later, is kind of put together. And it's a woody, long-lived, compartmentalizing perennial woody plants with a single main stem or multi-stem, undergoes photosynthesis and respiration. So that's what a tree is. And it's interesting as we talk through palm trees and conifers and deciduous, you can kind of go back to this definition to tell you what actually is a tree. And, it's interesting, there's shrubs and are they a tree? But here's our litmus test. And as we go through again, ask questions. You do need to know about photosynthesis and respiration. And we're going to touch on those later. The biggest thing that a tree and all the biology of a tree and the stuff that we're going to go through that works in a system, a tree is something that has adapted to survive without being able to get up and move around. It has to take the environment that it lives in. So all the systems and functions that we discuss have to do with a tree being able to survive in an environment that it can't run away from. And it has to deal with the impacts around it. So a lot of the systems and processes are built around a tree's need to survive in one place. Photosynthesis, you're going to hear a lot about. Obviously, all plants photosynthesize. Really, it's the process of creating sugars from sunlight and water. And it's this chemical process. You may see a question that has, a multiple choice on the order of this: water, carbon dioxide, glucose, and oxygen. So the inputs and the outputs, you need to be able to be clear about. And you also need to differentiate, what photosynthesis creates. Basically, it takes sunlight. It only happens in the daylight, and it needs water and sunlight, and it's going to create basically sugars and oxygen as a byproduct, which is going to be different than like respiration. Respiration is a different thing, and it's not to be confused. Kind of Cliff Notes versions of a lot of this stuff that you're going to find in the book. You can dig deeper. These are key things. Want everybody to remember those things because you do need to know the differences. So photosynthesis happens like we saw on the last slide. It's going to be sunlight and it creates sugar, and then sugar becomes allocated into energy that the plant can use. And that's the process of respiration. It can happen anytime. It can happen in the night. So it's very different than respiration, and it is different than transpiration. Transpiration is basically the exchange of gases and the movement of water through the tree and then going out of the foliage of the plant. And that's what we're going to call transpiration. We think of, there's a term called transpirational pull, and that's really how the leaves are going to basically be pulling water from the ground, and that's going to help everything stay with pressure, turgor pressure, which keeps the leaves full and basically being drawn up through water being pulled out of the tree. So hopefully you understand the difference. We have photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration. As far as kind of the tree biology goes, these concepts are critical and they're going to come up on the test. So, read about these things a little bit more, but knowing the differences in those systems is completely essential, because you're going to need to know this. And it also is going to help you understand how trees work, which will then go into all the things that we do to trees and ultimately have you make good decisions on that. So the different types of trees that we have are monocots and dicots. There's very little to do with palms in Colorado, obviously. We don't see them here, but you're going to take this certified arborist exam and it's going to be on there. Monocots, palm trees, they do fit the test of all the things that we had as a definition of a tree. They are woody, but the structure of them is more like a grass plant. Where they grow from and how they move their bundles are different than a tree. They don't than a woody. They're also a woody. You can see I'm confused as well. But a monocot's really like a giant grass plant, but it does photosynthesize. It has respiration, transpiration, and it's such a fibers. So it isn't a tree, but we talk about the physiology beyond that. There's a lot of differences. But a monocot, the only thing is going to be palm trees, whereas dicots are all the deciduous and coniferous trees that we deal with, especially in Colorado. So palms being monocots, they don't form rings of xylem. They basically have this xylem dispersed throughout the tree. Whereas if we cut down a woody tree, like a dicot tree, you're going to have these rings that are layered upon layer upon layer, whereas a palm tree has it puts on growth basically from the bottom up, and it doesn't keep putting a layer upon itself. So the vascular system is dispersed through the tree of these hard sheathing fibers. We're not going to spend a ton of time on palms. This is kind of it, but looking at this, the leaf scars, the stem, the crown, and the canopy, you may be asked to kind of name these parts. Obviously, the root system on palms is very different, much shallower from the environment that they grow in. Whereas a dicot, it's very different. The root system is much more significant. It's designed to grow in a different environment than palms. It's going to have this trunk, leaves, needles, and the crown, which is all similar. But know the difference between a palm, a monocot, and the other plants, dicots. So looking at a tree, these are another critical things to know. And I would encourage everyone to take, and I have a piece of wood here. Next time you're out, look at a piece of wood, identify these things. You got to do it. If you do that, when you take this test, you're going to be able to look, it's going to stick. And it's not going to be so foreign so next time you're out looking at trees, take all these things and do it, whether it's the bud or trying to understand the outer bark, inner bark, and phloem, do that. Because you can see it, and then you're gonna remember it. But obviously, the outer bark is the outside of the tree. Then we have this thin layer of a phloem, and then the xylem makes up all of the rest of of the tree that's mainly the structural component that moves water and nutrients. And then the heartwood is in the center, which is really just kind of abandoned piece that doesn't do much, but these are the function, the parts of the tree. And I really want you guys to go out and identify this with a piece of wood. So xylem and phloem, obviously the xylem tissue, from looking at that last slide, makes up the majority of the bulky mass of the tree. You could consider xylem almost like if you ever looked at a fiber optic line, and it's all these tubes that are basically starting at the root tip of the tree and going all the way to the extreme top tip of the tree. And they're just these bundles of these little tubes that are moving water and minerals one way. They take it from the ground up into the rest of the tree. There's no end walls. They're just a conducive system of these fibers. And as they become, this lignin is what creates the strength of the tree as it grows, and becomes strength for the tree. Whereas the phloem is a very thin piece. If you think back and look at that tree, it's right between the bark and the woody portion of the tree that we call the xylem is this thin layer. And that does have two-way, that's moving water and food energy around the tree. And it does go up and down. There's the movement of this stuff around to be able to put it to different portions of the plant as needed. And then be aware there's also some lateral movement, and these are called rays. So there is some, these are all for going up and down. And there is another part of the tree called rays, or in the inside, that does allow for things to go laterally, sugars and resources that the trees may need. And again, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to stop. I'm going to move along fairly quickly. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up or something.
You sound good, Jason.
Okay. So the anatomy of a twig. This is another one that's going to be on the test. And I've got a twig here. And I would encourage you, once again, take the Certified Arborist book, grab a twig, and look at these things. Different trees. I've got, it said Buckeye here. And different trees, it's harder to tell sometimes the annual growth and the internodes. And this Buckeye is really good. It almost looks like that, exactly the one that they have on this. But you can look at these, and once you do that, you're going to remember things a lot better. So you have the terminal bud, obviously is at the tip of the plant. Terminal buds really have the most activity. Most of the growth is going to come on that terminal bud. And no, the leaf scar is pretty obvious. You can tear the leaf off, and that's what's underneath. These lateral buds go off to the side, very logical name. Do be able to look at a bud here and understand what that year of growth is. It's important. You'll probably be asked this. And then just look at a shrub, understand what the internode is between the buds, the bundle scar, and what a node is. And if you do that with a tree twig, I think you're going to remember it a lot more than me showing you this slide. The anatomy of roots. Obviously, I don't think you're going to be able to go out and grab a root. So this one, take a look, but it's very similar. The lateral, the terminology of the lateral and the terminal. We have the root cap at the very end. So a little bit of a different terminology, but things going off to the side are lateral. Some trees do have when a tree is younger, it's going to send a tap root or a sinker root down. And then there are root hairs off of these roots that are going to help bring in water and nutrients from the soil. So things to know about roots. All these are going to kind of come together and concepts of how the tree functions. So obviously roots have things that they do. Anchoring the tree is obviously the most important. And depending on the type of tree and the top growth of the tree, the root system and what is needed to anchor is going to vary. Roots have to have oxygen to grow. Roots cannot just grow in an environment with just water. So they will drown. So all trees need oxygen. They also store a lot of food energy. So if you cut a section of roots off, you need to know that there's carbohydrates and food energy actually stored in the root system of the tree. That varies seasonally, depending, and it varies from tree species and it varies from the types of roots. But you do need to understand that that is a function of roots, is not only to be a conduit for water and nutrients, but it actually stores energy as well. And they're only going to grow when the right combination of water and oxygen exist. And that's going to lead us into soils. You often hear people talk about how tree roots chase water or they seek it out. And these are a lot of these misnomers that we get. Really, there needs to be a proper environment with a combination of water and oxygen. And it can be, depending on the tree, a fairly broad range of that combination of water, oxygen. But without those two, then roots just won't grow there. And, if you think about, sometimes roots get into concrete, or they grow in between concrete. That is functioning in a way such that roots have that environment to grow in, but they're not going to push their way through a spot that doesn't hold that to go to water or oxygen on the other side. It's a pretty important concept to understand about roots. Now we're going to go into soil. That was a pretty quick blow through of, I think that might have been chapter 1. So again, read through this, take a look as much as you can at trees and look at them and compare them to what you're reading about. When it goes down to looking at the leaves and the different parts of the leaves, just take a look at it. And I think you're going to find that helpful. So we're going to talk about soil, not dirt. I mean, dirt, I guess, is just a generic term for something that is brown and on the ground. So it could be a lot of different things. Soil is actually a living thing that has a lot of things going on inside it. You need to understand what they are if we're going to be successful at helping trees grow and also passing this test. So you're going to be you're going to be asked about the soil profiles. The organic top horizon is really what you need to understand the most, because there's a lot going on there. This is the organic matter, and trees break down and put carbon back in the soil. And this starts the life cycle of a lot of different things that are happening that make it habitable to trees. So that top area is the richest portion. And as we dig down, and again, this is something you could do, is go out and if you're planting a tree, or if you have the opportunity to dig a hole, you're going to see these layers, and they're very clear. And depending on where you are, they might vary, but they're going to show up somewhat like this. And the O, A, B, and C horizons, have different levels of soil texture and makeup. And they also, as you get down into the lower horizon, there's not as much organics and there's not as much life happening in that top area. So obviously, when we plant trees, we need to know what's habitable for soil microorganisms so that roots can grow and also have oxygen. Those lower horizons aren't going to be able to get oxygen into them, so we can't have roots there. So, people always marvel over this concept that tree roots don't grow that deeply. The typical person that doesn't know a lot about trees assumes that tree roots go 3, 4, 5 feet down, but they just don't, because it's not habitable for them. There's not oxygen down there. There's not organic matter. And water is varied, and a lot of times we get into bedrock layers. So again, take a look at it, do some digging, look at where the tree roots are, and it's going to help you remember all of this stuff. So if you can dig a hole and label these horizons for yourself, I think you're going to remember it. Soil textural triangle. Need to know about this concept. I mean, basically, soil is made up of a combination of these different types of soils, being clay at the extreme, sand, and silt. And those are our 3 components, and everything else in between is made up of a portion of those. And this textural triangle, basically all soils are going to fall into somewhere on this triangle. And it's important to understand the characteristics of these different items: clay, sand, silt, and then, loam is really the optimal. I don't know if you see my pointer, but that's this brown area here. And that's kind of the makeup of soil that trees and shrubs and plants can like mostly. And it's not an equal percentage of silt, sand, and clay. It's this percentage here that's going to be optimal for getting that water holding capacity and oxygen and the ability for trees to grow into that loam. Obviously, we work on all sorts of levels, typically in Colorado, more in this clay loam to clay and silty clay. So understanding what your soil type is really going to help you manage your trees. And you got to be familiar with how to read this out and what it means when you take your test. So the big differences with sandy soil versus clay soil, it really is. So if we think about it, it's very logical. You don't need to look at this. Think about sand and think about clay. If I pour a cup of water into sand, the water just is going to go right through it because we have these larger pores and there's a lot more space inside there. Whereas clay soil doesn't have as much of that space. So it takes a lot longer for the water to move through it, and it's going to hold it for a lot longer. So, you know, we call this term porosity as far as how water can move through it and the pore volume. So sandy soil is going to have less porosity, small with larger pores, and clay soil, smaller pores, greater porosity. So you may be asked that, what has greater porosity or less porosity, but understand the concepts of clay versus sand. And if you just think about a cup full of each, it's going to make sense to you. So soil moisture and plant growth, obviously they are related. There's a level soil or moisture that is going to be uninhabitable for roots. And if it's too much or too little, you're not going to be able to have that. So soil's pore space determines the water holding capacity of a soil. So the greater amount of micropores means a higher water holding capacity. So knowing what we know about clay, obviously that's going to be more than sand. So we want a well aggregated soil structure, and that's going to allow, you know, so if it's clay, it's not good. And if it's sand, it's not good. But in this middle, we're going to call it a well aggregated soil structure. There's going to be able to hold some oxygen in there as well as water and be drained properly. You know, a heavy clay soil that's been compacted, which we'll talk about. Obviously, if you take clay and then you squeeze it into a ball really tightly, it's going to have less ability to hold water. So we want to have, you know, a really tightly packed clay is not good. It doesn't allow for any drainage and there's no space for oxygen. So tree roots need adequate gas exchange as well as adequate water to thrive. We need that combination. So looking at this little chart here on the left, you know, this available water in this middle zone with our soil makeup is where we want to be. If we get too dry, we get to this wilting point, there's just no water in there. But if we get above this called field capacity, then there's just water in there and you can't get any oxygen and it's not available. The tree roots can't get it. So obviously healthy soils equal healthy trees. Pretty much all the problems we see with trees have to do with soil ultimately. In Colorado, these is built environments and most of our trees are in areas that they weren't. Some of us do work in some areas where they're native trees, but even there, a lot of the issues we see have to do with soils. But in urban environments with arborists dealing with, we're almost exclusively dealing with soils. So understanding what you can and can't do with soil is critical. So I'd encourage you guys to really dig into soils and how trees are affected by them, because it really comes down to what you can and can't fix. And we have to be, as arborists, not doing things that don't work. So understanding pretty basic soils is going to help you be a good arborist. Looking at this unhealthy versus healthy, that compaction issue is huge. You know, if we have a clay soil and it gets walked on for years, that's over time going to become less good for the tree because these pore spaces are pushed together and there's just not oxygen in there. So an ideal soil makeup, looking at this, there you can see these percentage of air and a soil particle and what water's in there, and it's not all pressed together. This is what a tree wants. It needs to have these little brown pieces of oxygen. There's water in there, and these soil particles that aren't just packed together. So, if we look at a nice bag of topsoil that we pour out of a bag, it's pretty awesome, and it looks like this. And you can put some water in, and it holds some moisture. But if we compact that tighter, it's less favorable. But at least it has some organic matter, so it doesn't completely compress, whereas clay would just be a ball, and a tree root just would not be able to grow in there. What makes a healthy soil? These are all the things you need in the perfect world. And obviously, trees are going to survive in really challenging conditions. But if you want your tree to have an optimal soil condition, you have to have soil microorganisms. If you don't have that, these are going to have all sorts of functions in trying to help soil. They're actually going to be working through the soil, creating more oxygen and alleviating compaction, breaking down minerals into absorbable nutrients. All the factors that we just talked about are going to be enhanced by soil microorganisms. It's not going to be compacted. Like we talked about before, a good loam soil that gets completely compacted from driving an excavator over it for a long period of time is going to be, more challenged than a more clay makeup soil that has never been compacted. So thinking about that pressure, it's just pushing these particles together, not giving space for air and oxygen. Well drained, that means water moves through it reasonably well. We've all probably seen houseplants that, you put in something and you don't have a hole in the bottom, and you water it every day, and it just can't move that water out, and it becomes anaerobic, and it smells bad, and the roots just rot away. They just can't grow in that material. And then the soil pH, which is another thing we're going to talk about later in more detail. The optimal range is 6.3 to 6.8. We don't have that luxury in most all of Colorado. So different trees have different abilities to tolerate thresholds on all of these fronts. But the soil pH optimally would be, if we were creating a custom soil for trees, that would be where we would want to be. So we wanted the ideal soil makeup. When we talked about this clay, sand, and all these other factors, 45% solids, 25% water, 5% organic matter, and 25% airspace. That's the perfect world for tree roots. And if you create that environment or have that environment, tree roots are going to go crazy in there. And the ability for them to grow will be impeded variably with less of that. So looking at an uncompacted versus a compacted, it just reduces that pore space. And that therefore reduces drainage and the ability for soil microorganisms to grow. So bulk density, this is another thing you need to understand what it is. It's basically a tool that we might use to understand how our soil is functioning in this. And it's going to tell us, how compacted it is, and the different types of soil type that we have. So basically, you dry the soil out and we take the weight, and the lower the bulk density, the lower the weight, the more pore space. So it's a lighter for the same volume of soil weighed to one next to it. The lower the weight, the more pore space it's going to have. So if you had a more sandy, loamy type soil compared to a clay, that's sandy, loamier is going to come out the same volume at a lower weight. And that's going to indicate that you have more pore space. So what's going on with the trees and the plants in the soil? When we talk about all these different factors that are happening in the soil microorganisms, there's a whole community of living creatures and things underneath the soil. And this kind of runs through all of them when we talked about soil microorganisms. And understand what these are. They're all things that are actual, just because we can't see them, it's not hocus pocus. But, we know we can see an earthworm, but, our buscular mycorrhiza may be harder to get your head around, but it is clearly there. And if you just do a little bit of research, you'll see that it happens. You can even see some of these. Some of these are microscopic, and some of them aren't. You're not going to see protozoa or nematodes in your soil, but you're going to see earthworms, and all these different things are happening in the soil that are actually living, that are really affecting how healthy our soil is. By overwatering, compacting, use of herbicides or pesticides can all limit the ability for these to function. So as we think about how we manage a tree, we got to think about how everything we do is going to impact these different things, like picking up leaves, as simple as that, or hauling away all your grass clippings, or using certain fertilizers that might be high in salts, are all going to have impacts on these different organisms. And if we're limiting them, then we're not promoting the tree. And all of these communities, depend on plant-derived carbon. So by taking everything away from, like we often do in these, residential landscapes and hardscapes, we really make it hard for these things to exist. So being aware of what they are is really important. I'm sorry, I was just looking at some of the questions coming up here. Humus has been pretty effectively debunked. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but I think we can call that a generic layer of carbon. We know that there is organic material in there, and I'm not sure that humus is still on the test. It is still in the 4th edition of the guide, so I'll have to look into that one further for you, or maybe you want to. That's what I know about that. So the rhizosphere is actually a zone around 1 to 2 millimeters around the root. We call the rhizosphere, and you could think of it as the ecosystem in that small zone right around the roots. Very close proximity. There's exudates that come from the roots that create a different environment than would be farther away from the root. That's really what you need to know, that exists, and it is in that zone, and it really is an ecosystem specific to that 1 to 2 millimeter area around the roots. We talked about pH, and the concept of pH is somewhat complicated, but it doesn't need to be for your purposes. The negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration is what it means, but really it's the measure of a soil's acidity or alkalinity. So we need to understand soil pH for what that is. You kind of are going to need to know that neutral is in that 7 spot, and then as we go up, we're more alkaline, and as we go down, it's more acidic. It should be as basic as that, I believe, on your test. But understand that pH does affect plant health, and why. So the why is soil pH varying can vary the availability of minerals to the plant. So if you have a range, especially in the micronutrients, if we get into these very alkaline pHs, then we can't pick up a lot of micronutrients. So understanding where they're available, obviously some of these macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium have a much more range, but these micronutrients are very critical to plant growth, and without them, they're limiting factors for a lot of the plant processes. So without being in that range, often we need to know, even for selecting the right plant for the right place, there's certain plants that have ranges that can tolerate more alkaline or acidic soils. So understanding the pH of our soil is pretty critical to be able to spec a plant, and then how you're going to grow it there. Certainly, if we can't really adjust soil pH through trying to do additives into soil. You would really have to do wholesale change in the soil type. You can mask it. There's the use of chelated nutrients, which are plant available, and they make these micronutrients available in these pHs that are not optimal, but it's not a very sustainable thing. So understanding that soil pH and how it affects the plant is what you're going to need to know. So as I said, urban soils are really difficult to change. Soil replacement around a tree is a hard thing to do. It certainly is something that, we as arborists we're doing more of with air spading and radial trenching and, just going in and wholesale changing the actual soil. But putting in a fertilizer additive really isn't going to change the soil structure. So when we plant trees in hardscapes in downtown areas, and we want to make sure we're using a good soil, a structural soil is a soil that can be compacted to an engineering usable place in a hardscape where it can have structures on top of it and not settle, but still has the ability to have the proper pore space that it needs to be able to have plant health. So these kind of built soils are kind of what we need to do. If we dig stuff up and throw them in our planting pits, then we've learned over the years that that's not going to perform well. So there's a lot of opportunity in this for us as arborists to understand, if you can come up with an idea that helps urban trees live another 5 or 10%, or even 5 to 10 years, however you want to look at it, longer, then that is something that is going to be invested in heavily. So it's really understanding soils, limiting factors, and how they function. But you can't just plant it in crappy soil and fertilize it, or put additives in through a soil injector and think that you're going to solve any problems. Sometimes we can mask them, but it's really important to understand that things like pH and soil structure are really not going to change from us pumping things into that soil. Irrigation of trees, moving through quickly once again. If anyone has questions, feel free to hit the chat. I'll try to watch that more closely at this point and, raise your hand. Hopefully everybody's doing well. Irrigation in trees. Obviously, we need to understand this, and talking about that soil and how different soils function is a lot. It's going to help you gain a better understanding of why and how we irrigate trees. So starting with that soil structure knowledge is going to help you understand more of the things when we talk about irrigation regimes. I can tell you right now, as an arborist, your biggest value is teaching people how to manage water. That is the number one factor on trees, whether you're making a mature tree, try to keep it from declining, or help new trees establish, or you moved a bunch of trees and you want them to live. These irrigation regimes are critical, and that's going to be your most valuable tool over the years. It's not going to be how well you can climb a tree or how you can cut a tree down or what all the varieties that really knowing how to properly irrigate is going to be the differentiator and how successful you are at saving trees and helping them establish and thrive. I can say that truly from experience. So understanding the soil, like we talked about before, is going to help you understand how to water. So we really need to know about how water moves through and how long it will hold water. Obviously, a coarse sand soil has this water holding capacity it's just not going to hold as much. It's going to need water, or it's going to need watered more frequently, as opposed to a clay, which could be, if you had a straight clay, it might have to be watered once every 2 or 3 weeks. It takes so long to dry out, and all in between there's going to be different variables. So it's really important that we understand, and you can read all this and look at all these charts, and you can have a good idea of where you are. But ultimately, you got to be able to get into that soil sometimes with a soil probe and dig around and see where the water's getting. Unfortunately, in these built environments, we often have really strange things happening with soil. Someone might put sand on top of a clay, and that's a real problem because it's going to move through, and this layer that we're managing on the top, and it's not going to drain at a certain level. Sometimes people will really like over amend a planting hole. And if you put a bunch of peat moss and sand into a clay hole, it's what we would call a perched water table. It's going to drain much quicker, and then it's going to hit that parent soil, and you're never going to have a healthy tree, because the roots are just going to have wet feet, and you're going to say, well, I was watering it perfect for the amendment that I put in. So understanding that soil that you're planting the tree in, the parent soil, the native soil, is really important. And kind of understanding what happened to that soil. Has it been compacted? Did they put a top layer on? So doing some research and looking at this. But overwatering really is as damaging to trees as totally drying them out. It has the same effect, just roots can't grow. So trees versus turf. Unfortunately, we live in a world, or fortunately, depending on what you're into, trees and irrigation systems are typically designed, I don't say trees aren't designed, say irrigation systems and landscapes. A lot of times they're built, for better or for worse, around the needs of turf. So these clocks are often set, and everything's designed to do pretty frequent watering. And trees and turf, they just have opposite regimes. Trees are going to like a deep watering, and then the tree will need to come to dry after that. So understanding, sorry guys, apologize for that. I knew there'd be distractions. You guys got me still? Okay, sorry about that. So the difference between trees and turf, that frequency and duration. So these are the keys to managing healthy trees. And as we, again, talking about that irrigation being such a valuable tool for you to be able to be a good arborist over time, these are the key factors that we focus in on with landscape managers, whether it's the homeowner or the landscaper. We're always trying to dial this in. And when they leave and they do that landscape install, how often do people tell us, oh, I water 3 times a day or twice a day, and I water it for an hour or 10 minutes. So often it's 10 minutes 3 times a day. So we're watering, very frequently and not much duration. Tree is going to want, ultimately, probably they could water it once a week and let it saturate for 2 hours. And that's a perfect world for trees, because we dry it out and we get that pore space into the soils, and it's going to be a better environment for roots. Turf is going to start to brown out, but I always will tell people that you can treat your grass can be stressed, but it's so much more damaging to your trees to put them into that stress. When we talk about the need of respiration, right, the utilization of energy into the tree, that's going to go somewhere where it's needed. And if that's growing new roots, or it's putting out new growth, or it was wounded, all of a sudden, if that exceeds the photosynthesis that's being created of the sugars that feed that respiration, then we have an issue. And so if we're continually stressing the trees and having energy have to go to new root growth, it really affects the tree system as a whole. And that's why a lot of the trees in heavily watered landscapes look wimpy. So understanding the drainage potential of the site is another thing. You can look at a property and you can see the trees that are on the higher areas are performing better than the ones that get all the runoff from the landscape. So looking through this, understanding these classes of soil, where they are on the property, is going to vary how you manage water. Already talked about that one. Tensiometers, we'll talk about that. Just know what it is. These are tools that can tell us how much water is in the soil, especially at a lower depth. They come in all sorts of different kinds. Some of them are really complicated, and they use like barometric pressure. They have to be calibrated to the soil type, and they're going to tell you when that soil needs to be watered again for a tree. So if you're doing like a big tree management project, you're really trying to optimize it, these might be something that you want to do. There's some simple ones that tend to be very inaccurate. Obviously, if we're trying to work with trees, we need to be managing it in the 6 inches, 12-inch range below ground. So But you just need to know that a tensiometer is a tool that can be used to monitor this, because you might look at a grass area and it's getting watered a ton, but if you go down 6 inches, it may be dry all the time. So I always tell everyone to carry around a soil probe. They're often used for sampling, but if you stick these things in the ground, get down 6-8 inches, you can really see that soil. It's a really important tool as an arborist to have, and you're going to be able to manage water much better with one of those tools. We've been talking about tree biology the whole time, but we're going to jump into more of the tree biology as it pertains to woody trees and pruning and whatnot. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything or wants to go back on any of that, but I'll just go ahead and burn through it if not. Don't see any chats or raised hands. So mentioned earlier, Alex Shigo. This is someone who you need to know. He really is the researcher who's given us a lot of the information pertaining to trees and how they grow, all the systems of pruning, and has evolved via his research. He's no longer with us, but he was around not that long ago. I got the opportunity to meet him and go to his lab in New Hampshire years ago, and incredible. He basically took trees and just chopped them up into different sections and pieces and looked at the chemical responses, and really was the person responsible for changing the way we do tree work.
Oh, you can see the tree.
Somebody asking a question? I'm sorry.
Correct.
I'll go ahead and say it again. Did someone ask a question? I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up. Thank you, Donna. So yeah, Alex Shigo, again, he did these things where he took these trees and chopped them up, and from this is what we're going to talk about next. He's responsible for the science that's evolved in the way we prune trees. You need to understand the CODIT system, the compartmentalization of decay in tree model, and that's something that's definitely going to be on your test. So it's a model of compartmentalization. Basically, the way trees function, go back to when we talked about how a tree is an organism that can't run away and it has to sit in its environment. And this is really the key thing that made it successful. It has to be able to wall off impacts. If you hit it with a hammer, or you drive a truck into it, or you prune a branch off of it, this is the response of the tree. And it's made up of 2 parts. Part 1 occurs within the tissue that is present at the time of the injury. And then part 2 is some tissue that's created after that. So there's 2 parts of that model. The 4 walls of CODIT, it's a multi-dimensional model. Again, you really got to chop a tree and cut a piece off, and then you're going to be able to see these things. This is a drawing that is fairly poorly done that I did to try to show this, but basically we've got vertical spread, wall 1, and then we've got inward spread. You can see this dimensionally, and then wall 3, lateral, because we have the way that this tree is broken up. It has to have lateral separation as well. And then wall 4 is going to be the new part that is formed after the injury occurs, which we call callus tissue. But you can see 1 through 3 being part 1 and wall 4 being part 2 of the model. So if wall 4 fails to form, then this cambium is killed out, and that's where we start to get decay into the tree. So if we can get this wall 4 to close off our wound, we basically compartmentalized that wound, and the tree will grow over it and put layers upon layers, and it can succeed over that. So it's going to trap that stored energy within the tree, within the ray cells we talked about that move things laterally are going to be saved that way. But if wall 4 can't form, then we have a pathway, and we lose it takes a lot more energy away from the tree. So understanding this is going to lead into pruning and all types of things that we do to trees, and it's going to help you understand all these concepts, understanding, because it all has to do with this wall 4 and making sure that it can successfully be formed and close off that portion of the tree. So the branch protection zone is something that we would have been unaware of again without Shigo doing his research. And this is a slide from one of his research, and he cut this down, and we can see this different coloration here. And this is called the branch protection zone. And trees have this to be able to protect themselves, and it's basically going to be readily able to create that wall 4 and limit the spread of a pathway into the tree. So having this branch protection zone is critical, and certain tree branches can create it. Codominant stems can't, but it's basically in a branch. And if that branch gets broken or cut, it's going to be ready for action. It's all these cells that will convert to phenols, and terpenes that will inhibit decay in the tree. So that's kind of something that was there that you would never know unless you did this extensive research. So we can see that branch protection zone in there. Basically, the old way of pruning, called flush cutting, removed pretty much the entire branch protection zone. So when we look at how a tree is going to close over a wound following a pruning cut or something, obviously, if we take that whole area out, which is rich in these sugars and energy, if we take that off by cutting this whole thing off, it's going to take a lot longer for that tree to close over, and it's just not going to be good. The amount of decay in that tree and the amount of energy that comes away from it is going to be much greater. Another way is to create that physical barrier over wall 4. So if I take this stub cut and a natural branch might die and be able to be shed as this gets built up around here, but it's going to take a lot longer for that to happen. You're going to get that branch protection zone is in there, right? But if I can't remove this stub, that's going to sit there and let a pathway for decay, and it's not going to be, wall 4 is not going to be able to be created and close over until I eliminate that barrier. And so when we start talking about pruning cuts, we're going to realize how important it is to make a proper cut. These little teeny stubs are a lot worse than the tree's natural mechanism of, if that branch died, that branch defense zone is going to kick into action, and that branch will be shut off and it can be shed. We've all seen trees where this tree branch has been growing a long time, and all of a sudden I can just brush it, or the weight of the branch will just let it shed away. And then if we look back, we see wall 4 ready to take over. But these man-made stub cuts are super damaging, and they're going to also create a barrier to that wall 4. So this comes down to how do we make a pruning cut? This is clear, easy stuff that's going to be in your test and in the book. It's pretty straightforward. We understand these things. We make that undercut and we make that second cut. Obviously, if we were to not make this process, we can tear this away and it will end up peeling, and we're causing damage to the ability for wall 4 to form. If I have a big peeled out cut, I've torn away a bunch of that area that was ready to close over that wound. So we're going to make our undercut, a top cut of the second cut, and then the branch bark ridge. We're trying to identify this branch collar, which in different trees, it's different. It's hard to tell. And you kind of got to really look at it carefully, and you got to go look at the response of the trees you pruned, and you got to understand what the tree that you're pruning is and how that collar is formed. Sometimes it looks like a stub from the ground if we look at the branch bark ridge, but it's really not okay to make too deep of a cut or too shallow of a cut. We've either taken off a part of the ability for it to form that callus tissue and made somewhat of a flush cut, or we've left a stub, which we saw the reason we won't want to do that. So we never want to damage old callus tissue that was already formed. Like if we see some that was a cut that was made before and the callus is starting to come out, there is a ton of energy that you're taking away and stored energy, and it's important that we don't damage existing callus. I'll keep going backwards, sorry. Going backwards. Sorry, guys. So That's where we were. So looking at trying to identify that branch bark ridge and the collar, there's a lot of good stuff out there that will show you that. But I always thought, like, if you kind of look at where we're pretty much trying to make the smallest wound as possible. So when we go out onto a tree branch at this base area, if I cut too far in, I'm going to make a larger wound. And if I go any further, then I'm going to try to make a stub. So basically you could take a string on this branch bark ridge, which most trees have. It's kind of an upward turned area at the base of where that branch comes out, and kind of bring that directly across to where I'm going to make that smallest diameter cut without leaving a stub. That's how we're going to identify that spot. Looking back on collar cuts, you know, if you're going to know, and it's really important that when you make these cuts, you go back in time and look at them. They're going to be round. If it's more oval, it's going to be that you took out some of that, some of the collar of the tree. So a perfectly round donut hole cut means that you made that right. So going back and looking at your trees, you know, oak and a locust and a linden may all be slightly different. And it really is important. It's just going to show when that's a perfectly round closure that we've done a perfect job, and that's minimizing the energy expenditure for the tree to close that pruning wound. And there's an example of one that was cut too far into the tree. It's taking a lot more energy away. It's going to be slower callus formation. It's caused by the removal of that branch defense zone to some degree. So a few key points just to talk about when you're trying to understand the tree response to pruning. You got to know a codominant stem versus a branch, and there is a difference. And you know, that difference is, you know, a codominant stem does not have the branch defense zone in it. It's not set up to have that. So when we talk about training pruning and structural pruning, there is a difference between a codominant stem and a branch, and that can revert and change over time if you can slow the growth, because a codominant stem is a lateral that's greater than 50% of the diameter of the main stem. So looking at this picture, you know, this one off to the right is not going to have a branch defense zone. Really, it's not going to be set up to be taken off in one piece, whereas these smaller ones are going to be able to do that. And if we look at that main stem and the lateral off of it, you know, we make a choice differently to slow the growth of this lateral that's larger than 50%, so that the tree can deal with that, and it actually has that mechanism. Trees make their own food. We can't feed trees. That's a misnomer. You know, people say, I'm going to give it tree food. You know, you can fertilize, you can give trees things that will do different things to trees, but you can't give them food. They have to make that through photosynthesis, and they're going to create carbohydrates, sugars, and then respiration is going to allocate that somewhere within the tree. It's not something that we can do for them. We can just give them the things that they can use to help make that food more efficiently. So when we talk about making prescriptions to trees, you really need to understand that that's how it works. We don't feed trees, we can fertilize. Fertilizing does have the potential to cause more harm than good. You know, high salts often come. A lot of times nitrogen heavy, very soluble fertilizers are going to push a ton of growth on a tree, but that tree may not have needed that. It can result in faster growth than we want, weaker wood, large leaves that are often feeding insects and diseases more than anything. So understanding what the deficiencies are before we do any type of a treatment to a tree is really important. The trees with inadequate root systems can suffer greatly from improper fertilization. So if I give a lot of nitrogen to a tree that doesn't have a root system, you know, even if you think about the stability aspect of that, all of a sudden we put a bunch of top load on a tree that doesn't have a root system that can even hold it up. So we created a structural issue and a carbon allocation issue. So nitrogen is the most common. You know, people go down to the store and they buy these spikes and they buy these Ross root feeders, and gosh, it's can be really problematic. And all of a sudden these trees have tons of insects and diseases. Nitrogen is the nutrient that can leach the most. It's the most mobile in the soil. We could have environmental impacts from that. It can volatilize very quickly. All these are negative consequences. So a lot of these fertilizers have high salt indexes, and they can actually burn the plants and increase water demand. So if I'm heavily fertilizing a tree and I'm trying to manage a drought time situation, then I might want to think twice about what I'm doing there. And I don't know where I'm at on time right now because I can't follow, but we are about halfway there. I think we're in good shape. So facts about tree food. It's only made by foliage. I said this already, but when we think about pruning and all the things we do to trees, every time we remove foliage from the tree by pruning or anything else, we've reduced the amount of food and energy that can be produced and used and stored. So I understand that, these little factories that make food called leaves are really important to the tree. So everyone that we take out has an impact. So pruning can get looked at very differently once we understand that. This food doesn't move around, and this is, we said that there can be some lateral movement of carbohydrates and sugars, and xylem can allocate where it's needed. But being said, if a tree limb, I often try to tell people, like, look at a tree limb when you're looking at pruning or anything else as its own tree and it's growing in the system. And if a tree limb isn't making enough food, it's not going to pull food from somewhere else in the tree and reallocate it to keep this branch alive. So if we look at, like, often lower branches on trees that get shed away and lost because they don't get enough light, or spruce trees and someone cuts back the low branch in half and all of a sudden that branch can't make enough food, it's going to get kicked off the system. That branch defense zone is going to just wall it off, and it's going to say later, and it's not going to move them around. It's going to get shut off. So when we look at trees and how they grow and how we prune them, we really got to keep that in mind. A lot of times, we're trying to get some light into those lower branches on the tree that we want to keep around for longer to be evenly spaced. So the way we manage trees and how we prune them has to do with this fact. So another thing is interior foliage is often more productive. There's been research done about the photosynthetic capacity of trees in different parts of the tree, and the ones that are in direct sunlight putting on the most lush growth are often not creating the most food energy. So as we think about those interior sucker sprouts that the homeowner said, why didn't you clean all those off? Well, they're making food, and they may be making a lot of them. A lot of times you can look at certain trees. You might say a maple that grows pretty quickly, and all of this, that even you can see the color of that newer growth is not as deep green as some of those that are a little bit more shaded. So that interior foliage is important, and it often creates more food. And then much of the tree's food energy is stored in the tips of the trees and buds. And we also talked about the roots. So when we talk about topping and why we do or don't, it's really important to understand that. Awesome. Thank you for that, Diane. I'm on track. So yeah, understanding these things about tree food are going to help you not only pass this test, but they're also going to help you understand why these questions are being asked. So hopefully that's a help. The response to pruning. So when we make pruning cut, we're doing something to a tree. A lot of times the more we do to a tree, maybe the better off it's not. We're removing foliage. We're creating a wound that's going to require tree energy to respond. And again, if photosynthetic work is not creating enough energy for respiration, consuming it, then we have a deficit. So if we over prune a tree, especially an old one, we can really trigger that tree into an extreme stress situation. Anytime a mechanical injury, which pruning really is, we're wounding the tree, whether we take a chainsaw or hand snips or do anything that's pruning, hand picking foliage off the tree, that's going to be prioritized. It's a wound to the tree. And when we talked about how a wound response is, going back to Shigo and all that movement to try to wall this off and compartmentalize and build a wall for, that's taking a ton of energy. And so if the tree's doing something else, like putting out leaves at that time or pushing a big root flush, that stops. And that's why we often try to avoid pruning during the time of year when leaves are expanding, because it will interrupt that process. A lot of the trees around here, you know, how important is it? Well, it depends on all sorts of factors. What other things are influencing that tree? If it's fighting off some other pathogens, and how much stored energy the tree has. So just think about that when we make a pruning cut. That is number one priority, to all of a sudden deal with it. And pruning, you know, we can slow the growth potential. When we look back at that codominant stem versus a branch, you know, I could revert a codominant stem to a branch over time by taking away a lot of the food that's made in that part of the tree, because we talked about how it's not going to get brought from somewhere else. It's going to respond by slowing that tree. And that's why structural pruning works, if you guys are familiar with that. We'll talk about it later, but we can actually slow growth of a certain portion of the tree by pruning it more heavily than another. So we got to be conscious about what we take out of a tree. You know, it's crazy. We've all seen it. You know, over pruning is so damaging. You know, and here we are trying to be good arborists, and we've, you know, people often out of the trying to do the best thing, they over prune a tree. You know, if you were to take a book and look at an old pruning book and say, I got to take the crossing and rubbing and the disease this, and I need to do structure prune, and you try to do all these different things at one time, we're going to over prune that tree. It's really going to harm it. So looking at this is a picture, it's very common, is just taking too many branches out of a tree. And we'll talk about what that means and where those parameters are. So over pruning is done in a ton of different ways. We've always seen it. We still will continue to see it. But all we can do is learn and try to share our knowledge with other people, and hope that over time we have more trees that aren't getting destroyed. So lion's tailing is very common. You know, we do work all over in the mountains and Western Slope. And it's funny that, you know, a lot of the kind of more outlying, maybe, I don't know if you go out into Cheyenne or, you know, Grand Junction, where there's just trees everywhere, and people maybe don't have as much money to invest in them, and they don't necessarily hire good arborists, and there's a good business for people that just can cut trees but don't know about the science. They just see these things, you know, and they raise everything up to a certain height, and a lot of times it's as high as their bucket truck can work. So taking all of the interior lower branches off a tree is lion's tailing, and it becomes very heavy at the end. And we don't have good branch taper, and all of a sudden the limbs are very weak. Unwarranted removal of large limbs. So many times as an arborist, you're going to be asked, people focus, they look up over their house and they say, just remove that lowest, largest limb over my house because I'm afraid it's going to fall. Well, a lot of times those are very structurally sound. They don't have inclusions, but they're just a big branch, and they're the one they see over their house. And if you explain to them, you know, that branch is very structurally sound, and that's likely to catch other things that might fall from higher that are more likely to fall. Even a small diameter branch from 60 feet might be caught in this lower limb. So there's ways of educating, and, you know, all too often, well, the customer wanted it done. So we took this, you know, 10-inch limb off of a 20-inch tree. Hopefully by knowing what you know now, you can tell them at least come back over 3 or 4 years. We'll reduce the weight. Topping, again, it's done all the time, and there's still people that advocate for this, that obviously that's their business. You can look in the phone book in almost any community, and it'll have that as a line item of something they offer. It's very sad that we're still there, but obviously knowing all we know, just from what we've already talked about, topping is really butchering these trees, and it's taking all the stored food energy, and these aren't going to be branches that are tied into the tree. Tipping, there's a lot of people who will just go in and cut. Tipping just means heading back kind of indiscriminately to shape a tree out and make it round, and you're not looking at lateral branches, you're just taking weight off of the ends for no good reason, maybe an aesthetic. Over thinning, over raising, just trying to do too much of a good thing. You know, we used to call it pruning by the pound. You know, a guy's got a brand new chipper and he feels like he's trying to do really good work for this person. So next thing you know, they've taken 40% of the tree out. So be very conscious about this. Why not to top trees? You're always going to be asked this. I know that's something that people just think, hey, it looks dangerous, it's too big. So, you know, you're starving the tree, you're shocking that tree, you're going to open it up to tons more insects and disease. All the new limbs that come from that are weak. you're going to get a ton of rapid new growth. And, if you go back to a top tree and not very long, it's often as tall as it was, but much weaker attached. And so you've exacerbated this problem that people had of these tall trees failing. These pictures were down, I think, in Taos that I took, and there's so many trees there that had been topped, and we can see, so these areas where they came up, I don't know if you guys can see use the laser pointer, but these areas where these were topped are coming out, and these are not attached properly, and they're also decaying. So, and then the unfortunate thing is people will do this and then their house is sold, and down the road, you're leaving a huge problem with generations to come, which is the total opposite of what we want to be doing as arborists. So, oftentimes it will kill a tree. It will kill a tree in a quicker time than if you didn't do it. A lot of times people say, oh, I topped those trees 3 times. They were Siberian elms and they grew back. But if left untopped, that tree will live longer. It just has more food energy. It didn't have to expend it. And it's truly the case that you're shortening the life cycle. It's ugly and it's often very expensive because you have to do it quite a lot. There's a good example of lion's tailing, and these are all pictures that I've taken just in places running around. It's just hard to believe that that even looks right, but that's another way of doing it. It wastes these people money. You'd be much better off to do nothing to these trees. So talking about topping and how we do trees, the A300 is something that's going to be in the tests upcoming, and I don't know if everybody's aware, but there's a new ANSI standard, and it is going to be on these tests differently than it was in the past. So it's been a little bit of time on this, and I'll try to go through it quickly, but cover everything that we need to so you know what it is. But really, it was a big wholesale change to things like we took a lot of the terminology out of our recommendations, like basic maintenance prune and prune to a certain spec, and we've changed that entirely with this new system of ANSI A300. There could be an entire workshop on the ANSI standards, and there should be, because ultimately we're all going to be responsible for doing things this way. And I don't think a lot of us are, as arborists, are actually following this right now. So super important, and it will be on the test. So get a hold of the A300 and understand what is in here. It's very different than the one that was just a few years before. It's designed to improve workflow and the writing of specifications so that we can go out and make people kind of have apples to apples when they're looking at how they're selling tree work. As a profession, there's so many different things that happen to trees, and we really, all this work, and there's a kind of controversial. A lot of people don't necessarily like it because it's change, and I would say I was one of them, but as I've gotten my head around it and understand what it is, it really makes a lot of sense, and it certainly is going to be here to stay, so we got to learn it. So it's introduction of the systems and the way that we prune, and there's a lot to this. I'm going to have to go fast because, again, I could spend 2 hours on this. So removal of pruning method terms like clean, thin, and raised, those are no longer in there. And those would have been on your test before, and they won't be anymore. There's going to be a greater inclusion of other landscape plants like shrubs. We have a way to spec how to do certain shrub type pruning. It's going to be addition of names and description of pruning cuts and what they are and how they're made. The amount of pruning now in the ANSI A300, the maximum of 25% was removed, and we're looking at consideration of tree species, age, health, and site. So instead of having that one thing in there, now we have to consider these different factors. We have to specify what to remove, including location, the size range of the type of branches, like are we doing down to 4-inch, and where are they, and the types of cuts we're going to make. There's some new words called coppicing, retrenchment, and rejuvenation pruning that were not in the previous standards. So part 1 on the pruning standard, they shall apply to any person or entity actively engaged in the management of trees, shrubs, palms, or other woody plants. So, this is pretty much, if you're a municipality and you're putting out specs and you're still using a term like crown clean to 1 inch, you're not following the A300. So we kind of need to, understand that the burden is on any person. You don't have to be the guy trimming the tree. It's anybody that's engaged in the management really needs to be adhering to these. They should be written and administered by an arborist and other qualified professionals. So we shouldn't really go out to a tree and prune it without a spec. Following pruning operations, monitoring and following up should be made based on the objective, plant condition, site location, and growth rate. So if I go do a pruning job, I need to identify when I need to go back and how often and what's likely to be the follow-up on that. It's on me now. The performance standard shall not take precedence over industry safe work practices. So this is a big one. So when we look at line clearing pruning or hazard reductions or doing something that is for safety, whether it be the person that lives near the tree or our employees, then this performance standard is not going to take precedence over the safe way of managing this tree. Sometimes we need to do things that are out of spec because we have to do it for tree being safe. So this is something you got to become familiar with. It's the pruning process flow chart. When we're going to look at this, and it's confusing when you look at this initially, but hopefully walking through this with you guys will give you a little more insight and help you feel a little more comfortable with what this is. So, but get this, look at it, follow through. I'm going to bring it up a few different times, but basically, first we have to identify why we're going to prune the tree. We're going to define the objectives. What's my objective? We're going to consider species age placement, select the pruning system that fits. We'll talk about what these are, and then consider the amount, location, cut type, cut size, pruning cycle, interval. So how often am I going to need to do this? If I were to choose, shearing a shrub, how frequently am I going to need to go back versus just natural form thinning it? And we're going to write a spec, we're going to do the work, and then we're going to review and do it. This is ideally the A300 in a nutshell. So defining the objectives. What is it that we're trying to get out of this project? We got to understand why we prune, and that way we can know we do it right. So why do we do these objectives? Why is this in the A300? Well, we're going to be more efficient. We're going to have happier customers. If we just say prune tree, and we've all been there, and Mrs. Smith gets 10 arborists and she just says, just prune tree is my specification. Hopefully one of them will educate her enough to say, well, why are we doing it? Why are we even doing it? Do we need to do it? That way we can go out, our crews can go out and know what they're doing. If every guy on my staff, I have 110 guys, and if they all did things differently, we'd have serious problems if they all did it their own way. So we got to have something. The success of our industries relies on this. We got to articulate the needs, and people need to be on the same page. Hopefully, if somebody gets 10 bids, at least 3 people will educate someone as to why we're doing what, and sometimes talk yourself out of work because we don't want to do things that don't need to be done. So just like with electricians or plumbers or anything else, we got to have a standard. We got to hold ourselves. If we want to be paid more and we want to have this be a professional industry that gives us the ability to have a good lifestyle, we've got to differentiate ourselves just like all the other industries. So why prune trees? The pruning objectives as per the standard, there's got to be a reason. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing it. It might be to mitigate risk. That may be the only thing that we're doing. Just make this tree safe. It might be to manage tree health. It might be both of those. To develop or improve structure. So a lot of times we're going to have to start putting these, if we're an accredited tree care service, we're going to have to start using these. We should be using these on our proposals. Like, what's the objective? What am I trying to achieve through this? Is it mitigate risk, manage health, and develop structure? It could be, but there has to be a reason. We may be just doing it to provide clearance, which case we're going to spec maybe just remove those 3 low branches that are 4 inches in diameter and move on. It gives the homeowner an understanding of what you're doing, why, and there's obviously a big difference in cost and how much work we do, and the crews can then know what they're doing. It might just be to improve aesthetics. I just want this tree to look perfect. So the spec I write is going to be different than someone that wants to just mitigate risk. We might manage size or shape, using clearance. These are things that we can do. We have a way to get there, but we have to know that as the objective. Then we can figure out the system that we're going to use to get there. We may do it to manage flower and fruit production, and these are all out of the NZ. I'm not making these up. And we can use this. I love this about the new NZ standard. We have a way to manage wildlife habitat. So if I have that spec in there, I may leave a huge dead snag in a tree. Obviously I want it to be safe, but that may change the way I prune that tree, because now I've created an ability to have some raptor habitat, but still, maybe that was the only reason I was pruning that tree. I'm certainly not going to take the huge top out of a cottonwood along a river now, because the goal of that owner is to manage wildlife habitat, and that's acceptable thing that we can build a spec and do as an arborist now. We might be just mitigating risk. We might just take this cottonwood tree and say, gosh, all I want to do is make it safe. That's all I'm trying to do. So my prescription as an arborist, like my budget's low, but I need this to be safe. We may just take that whole big top out and leave that lateral, and we feel like we're there and we've identified when we need to come back. So if that's the only thing, then we're going to do differently. So all these different types of work might come in for mitigating risk, reducing or removing branches, reducing length of branches. But we have to specify what we're doing with all of these. The condition of concern, the amount to be pruned, type sizes and locations of pruning cuts. These all need to be in there. And I know you guys are probably like, what does this have to do with a test? But it does. You got to understand these concepts, and A300 is certainly a part of it. In addition to pruning with mitigate risk, we may have to consider supplemental support if there's a big codominant stem, and that might be part of my spec. And I have to put that in, all the different things that I can do. And then I need to tell them, well, I took that big live top and the tree's still rotting at the bottom. We really need to be back in 2 years and review, reevaluate, see how much decay is happening at the base again to try to help you continue to mitigate risk. Managing tree health. We need to note the physical location, the objective, list and describe. So maybe I'm trying to reduce fire blight in a spring snow crabapple. So the physical location, and where is that tree? The crabapple at the back of the house. The objective is to reduce fire blight, or prune out fire blight, or minimize fire blight. Manage the health, to improve plant health or control pests. Maybe I'm just pruning out the scale infested limbs. So I'm writing that spec. And this is just an example of some of the things that I might write in that specification that's going to help manage tree health. But I do need to put that in my specification. Any other additional information, like maybe there's one tree, a branch that's got to stay because of whatever reason, but it needs to go back in a couple years. So, and then we have to put in that specification, anything we're going to do, sterilization of tools. Do I need to get the tree, is it infested with a bark beetle and I have to get that off site and it can't be there. It can't be chipped and left on site at a certain time of year. All these things need to be in there. And then we do have to specify the monitoring interval at the end of that. So if I'm going to manage health as my objective and goal, these are the things I'm going to have to put into my spec when I do it. Talking about fire blight, obviously, we've got to prune that out. We're going to make it pretty detailed. Okay, we're going to remove branches of this size that have this in them, and it's going to be this far below the cut, and we're going to do it at this time of the year, and this is when we're going to come back and monitor to see if we need to do it again next year. Things like wood boring insects, you don't want to be going in, and if we're worried about a bark beetle on spruce trees or pinyon trees, the last thing we want to do is specify that to take doing a pruning job in the middle of the summer in an area where these trees are active, these insects are actively moving. And then there's structure pruning. If that's my goal, I'm going to write a specification on how I'm going to get there. It's very valuable. It needs to be done, and it's a different process than managing for health. So if I'm going to improve structure, We're going to prune to improve plant architecture. This is an example of what we might put in a specification for improving tree structure. Obviously, you can see in here, initiation of structural pruning early in the life of the plant. It's going to give it benefits. So we really can prune trees harder when they're younger. That's the whole concept around structural pruning. You can get more up on this by looking through the book and the arborist training, or Ed Gilman's books are pretty much the go-to on structural pruning. So restoration pruning would be included in this category. If a tree was topped and I'm trying to restore that to be a structurally sound tree again, I'm going to manage it differently than improving structure for a young tree. And I have to define this. This is restoration pruning. This is a project that we worked on where the trees were illegally topped, where there was an ordinance, and it was spec to have to go back in there and try to restore these tops. And gosh, to have to write that spec, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to go in and thin these epicormic shoots and favor the ones that are the largest and that are tied in the proper areas and don't have decay there, and you can't climb in it. So it takes a certain tool and you have to dangle off a crane to fix these. And so, you know, by knowing that, it's not like it's going to be very different than somebody else just going out there and saying, yeah, I'll prune your trees. And they might just cut the suckers off and climb up and let that top keep taking off. So we got to be able to identify that. And restoration pruning is in pretty much fixing any tree that was damaged from a storm or vandalized or somebody pruned it poorly. So 6 main strategies in executing a structural pruning program. Develop that central lead. It's going to be important that you know this. This may show up on the test. Identify the lowest permanent branch in the canopy, knowing that you can leave some temporary branches below that, but how we thin and prune that, we need to know what that lowest permanent branch is. Prevent branches below the permanent canopy from growing upright or too large. Space main branches along the dominant trunk. Keep all lateral branches a smaller diameter than the trunk diameter, going back to that codominant versus a branch in the branch defense zone, and try to suppress and slow growth on branches with bark inclusions or remove those branches completely. So when we have included bark, there's multiple ways that it may not be just to remove that whole half of the tree. We may just want to slow that part, and that's part of our structural pruning program. But this needs to be identified in our spec before we prune a tree, ideally. We can provide clearance. Maybe it's as simple as that, and that's our spec. So clearance of roadways, view pruning, power line clearance, but specify the parts to retain and the parts to remove. You know, maybe you're just removing 3-4 inch branches on the lower left side of the tree. And that's our spec, because that's what the homeowner wanted, and that's what they want to pay for. And that's what our crew will go out and do it. And there's not going to be any confusion. Sometimes it's for aesthetics, like make this tree look as perfect as you can. I want this to be a specimen cottonwood. So we may do it a little bit differently. And, you know, maybe that's even at a little bit of a cost to Tree Health, but this person's like, I want it to look this certain way. We can spec it, and obviously we're not going to take too much. We're going to use consideration, but we're going to do a much more detailed. We might take, you know, down to a 1/4 inch diameter, crossing and rubbing, and we may do some heading back to these laterals at that size, but we're going to identify that in our write-up. We might be managing size or shape, but we have to consider the species size and typical form to ability to tolerate. So if I'm going to spec something to be only 30 feet tall and it's a cottonwood and it's, you know, 100 years old, it's not going to work. So we have to evaluate that when doing these, and that's being dictated to us in the ANSI. Specify how you're going to do it. If you're going to reduce that size, are you going to head back, you know, all the branches of a certain height to a lateral of a certain size? Are you going to use shears? Is it going to be selective, or is it going to be indiscriminate? And then if I do that, how often am I going to need to go back to manage that properly? Retrenchment, this is a word that's new in the ANSI. You need to know what this is. So you might very well get this question, but really, so retrenchment is, if you think about, you know, as we grow older, we kind of hunch down and we become more lower to the ground. And, you know, if we look at an old tree and its ability to withstand, like say an old cottonwood or a willow in a row, the way that thing functions over time, it's losing its top pieces and it's starting to be able to hold up. It might have all these decay pockets down low, and the only way that tree can survive is to it loses some top and the wind sail changes, and it all of a sudden needs those lower branches, and the whole form of this tree changes. And I'd encourage you to start looking around at old trees that have never been touched, and these big old fence rows, and how they look, and they become shorter, fatter, branched lower to the ground. And so this term and a lot of the ANSI terms are really helping us keep trees around. It used, you know, we might be able to do what maybe used to be called topping, but we did it in such a way that we're actually doing retrenchment pruning. And now I don't have to remove that tree. So I've got a big old cottonwood next to my house, and the lady doesn't want to remove it, and I can't really head it back to 1/3 laterals. Well, I'm doing specking retrenchment pruning. I'm emulating natural form of the reduction of that tree. And we're going to treat it very differently if I'm doing a retrenchment type prune. But now this is an acceptable practice, and it helps us keep around trees that otherwise we might not have been able to. So here's some trees that, you know, these in a campground, and they wanted to keep them. And you might look at that and say, wow, that was a pretty harsh pruning job. But these trees are old, they were stressed, they had dead tops, they're declining, they have decay. So these trees were pruned back to be able to be retained for a while longer, but not necessarily pruned in the way that we would have pruned them before. So it's prescriptive reduction, removal of dead, damaged nesting branches. It's going to help restore some tree vigor, reduce risk. It will stimulate some new growth, and ultimately can keep some trees around longer. So definitely no retrenchment pruning. We might be managing flower or fruit production. We're going to treat trees very differently, and there's a spec for it. And, you know, can't tell you over the years, as I had employees that worked for me, and they're like, you got to go prune this apple tree. And these guys were guys that would just prune trees, ornamental trees, and they were so ingrained, and you can't do it this way or that way. But once we know we're planting this for flower, we're in the ANSI standard, it's okay to do this. We know we're shortening the life at the expense of creating fruit and having this tree. It's a crop. So we've identified that. It's okay to do that. Again, like I said before, managing wildlife habitat might be something, you know, we might just leave that snag and make it look natural in order to do that. And there wasn't a room for that in the old ANSI standard. It would be like, no, you got to cut that tree out. Where do I go with this? So we have a reason and we have an objective. So going through all that stuff got us to basically the first two things on this chart. Then we're going to consider species, age, and placement considerations when I'm making my spec. So this was a Siberian elm growing inside of a building, hotel. I got to manage this in a different way for different reasons. They obviously don't want to lose this, but it's also highly, you know, all sorts of things could go wrong here. So I've got to understand the species, the placement, the size, the age of that tree before I move to the next thing. Good, I'm on track. So that being said, we take into account something that we knew already. Get rid of my laser pointer so I can change this. No. So basically, large versus small tree pruning. We can take a lot more percentage wise out of a younger tree. It's a lot more resilient. I remember hearing Ed Gilman talk years ago, and he likened it to, you know, when you're younger, you can discipline the child and they can take it a lot more. And if you start to try to change habits and form, it's kind of a silly analogy, but it's true. You know, these younger trees, you can really take a lot out of a young tree. Whereas an older tree, you know, we could do open heart surgery on the old man, and it's just not going to go as well as on a 12-year-old. And there's a lot similar to that. So a lot of times we can't change a tree's structure or form once it gets older. So we can take a lot more, be harder. So when we're taking this into consideration, this is what we need to know. The computer is frozen. Can you guys still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. That freed it up. Okay. So now we got to select a system, and these systems are pretty interesting and cool. And I think you guys are it's not as complicated as you think when you follow through this. We've gotten through why we're going to do it. We've gotten through the size species consideration. Now we're going to look at these types of pruning systems. And these are all the systems that we're allowed to prune in now with the A300. You got to know them. Natural form pruning takes place of 99% of the tree, probably more like 100 for my company. All of the tree work that we're not doing pollarding, we're not doing topiary, we're not doing espalier, we're not doing cleaching. And I'll explain what those are. So all of these pruning systems, retrenchment and pruning for health, selective thinning, these are all going to be natural form methodologies. I'll bet you that would be a question on your test, like what's the most common, or fill in the blank, and it's natural form pruning. That's the system. So majority of the work commercial arborists will perform. It allows for raising, reduction, thinning, structure, hazard reduction, but we're keeping in the true form of the tree. We're not trying to manipulate the shape of this tree in a certain way for a result, unless it's going into one of these other classifications. Pollarding is something that you'll see when you go to Europe or even California. There's some Disney World and they do it. And there's certain tree species that can tolerate this. And there's certain people that have the budget to have you go back in every year. And it has to be described. So pollarding is really a form of topping, but it's done routinely. You can't just let it go. You've got to go back and take it to the same place every year. And there's only certain tree species, sizes, and ages of trees that will tolerate this. So it's a very carefully planned system. It's not topping. And if you go to certain cities, that's what they've chosen to do with these trees. And it reduces the lifespan of them, but it's a look that they're looking for. You see it a lot in European cities, but it has to be done every year, and it's costly, and it's got to be started at a young lifespan. You can't take a big old mature tree and say, I'm going to pollard this now. Topiary pruning is used to maintain a shape or form. It has to be the type of plant that's going to tolerate it. And honestly, in Colorado, we don't really have many. Obviously, junipers could be done this way and they don't love it, but places where we have boxwood and taxus and different things are going to lend themselves to it. But a lot of stuff you just can't do this with. Although I've seen some pretty fine attempts with Siberian elm. Say that. Espalier is training of trees. So, this is a manipulated form of pruning for a certain thing. It's in the A300. If we're going to sell someone this, we need to sell it to them with how often you need to go back. It's really important, because if we stop doing that, you've lost all the reason to do it. Pleaching, tying and interweaving plants to one another to create a form. If anybody's ever gone to the Bartlett Tree Research Lab, they have some amazing things done with trees in this, where they have tunnels, but it requires a ton of work over time, and it has to be specced. And it's a way we could do it. We could do this in our environment with a lot of different trees, but we have to understand what the work is and how often we need to come back. So we've selected that system. Most likely, with the trees being arborist, we're picking that natural form. So now I'm going to consider the amount of pruning. I'm going to what I need, what I can remove, and the location, size range, and your type of cuts. Am I going to be taking 3-4 inch branches off, or am I going to be taking a ton of branches down to a 1/2 inch? But it's in there that, we took out that thing of the 25% in the newest edition, but we have this term or this was wording of remove no more living material than what is necessary to achieve the specified objectives. So don't just cut a branch out for no reason. It has to be for that objective. If I'm just pruning for clearance and all of a sudden I start thinning out another side of the tree, or if I'm just pruning for tree health and I've made this crossing and rubbing branch off, that there's just no reason to do a lot of things. So keep checking yourself on that. We want to encourage good balance and structure by retaining lower and interior branches when compatible with objectives. Lower and interior branches are so critical to the tree because they actually create good taper. The longer we can leave those on, they're doing good for the tree. So many people just like, why didn't you take those couple low branches when I pruned this tree? Well, I didn't need to, and they're making food. And so keep that in mind when we're doing these. If I was pruning just for aesthetics and I had to take those out, I would, but I've explained it well and everyone knows ahead of it and when the crew shows up, and they know after. Why? Considerations when determining the spec dose and frequency. The tree species, will it tolerate that type of pruning that you're speccing? You know, is an aspen tree going to be pollarded? No, it's just not going to work. So the age of the tree, as we said, an older tree is not going to like to be structure pruned where you take out 40% of it. Where is that tree located, and is that going to fit into that specification? If a tree is in poor condition and in decline and weak, so critical that we keep as many live branches as we can. So if I've got an old tree and I'm trying to manage health and reduce decline, I may just be saying take as little as possible, keep that tree safe, but don't take any branches that don't have anything. Or we may say you're just taking one branch off that tree and it had a disease in it, a canker on it or something. We got to think about the presence of insects and disease when we're speccing this. Obviously the budget of the tree owner. Got to write specifications and communicate with the client, like what are we doing and why. That's we have to do as tree managers. This is something we now have to do in the A300. Complete the work, follow up, inspect, and recommend an interval for the next visit. That is now being dictated by the A300. What is the treatment follow-up regime? So rules to prune by. These are things that I think we're getting towards the end. So we'll have some time for questions. So these are types of things that I like to tell everybody, and that can help when you're talking about speccing and doing work. Know your tree, understand the age, species, growth habit, and health of the tree you're pruning. I can't really prune a young oak tree if I don't know what a big one looks like. And if I don't know the form of that tree, it's really hard for me to do that. So we really need to understand that tree, what it is. If you've never seen a mountain ash and you get a young one, and we need to know all these characteristics of that tree before we do it. So understand the tree. These are terms that will probably show up on the test. You need to know the X current versus D current. So if I don't know that growth habit of the tree, then all of a sudden I may make some serious mistakes on how I prune it. So this is the extreme example, X current versus D current, but certain trees have forms and shapes, and natural form pruning is to maximize and maintain that. So if I don't know the growth habit, then I'm not going to know how to do it. There's a lot of books out there on architecture of trees, and that's really valuable. Communicate the goals, understand what's desired from the tree owner, utilize the A300 spec and the level of detail before you do the work. It'll save everybody some headaches. You're not going to have callbacks. The customer's going to be happy. You're not going to have to micromanage every little project. That's the goal of the A300, get some standardization. It's called standards for a reason. This is what we're trying to do. And without communicating the goals, never going to get there. Looking at trees from the outside in, when we learned about how photosynthetically better those interior leaves are, and all these other things about trees making food and the response of pruning cuts being wounds, we really need to look at it differently than just getting up in the middle of the tree and looking around and saying, what do I cut out? Really trying to look at that tree to be balanced and even, and being able to open the tree up a little to be balanced throughout, instead of just cutting the low stuff off. You can reach. Leaving low limbs on a young tree can help create trunk taper. Talked earlier about how every branch can be looked at like a tree. So if I skin out everything in the middle, that would be just like cutting all the low branches off a tree. And what I'm going to end up with is a very skinny, very long branch, has poor taper. That's another term you're going to need to know. That just means that, good taper is larger diameter and it slowly goes down to the tip. Poor taper is like the same diameter for a long run. So hopefully that makes sense. And leaving those low limbs and low branches inside a tree help with taper. Lots of small cuts on the outside of the tree will minimize impacts to the trees, air circulation and canopy, and it's a more balanced and attractive tree. So that's often a difference, when we talk about a really quality pruning job and somebody that really knows what they're doing, they're following the spec, they may go in there and make a lot more small cuts versus getting up there and just cutting a few of the middle ones or raising it up and leaving or reaching as high as they can with the tools that they have. So it really changes the way you look at how you're going to approach a tree and the tools you're going to need if you look at it this way. If you can't make a good cut, don't make it all. These chainsaws on a stick and all the reaching off and trying to do a cut that you're not positioned properly for, the tree's probably going to be better off if I don't. Like looking at this picture, somebody used one of those chainsaw pruners and they stood on the ground and they made follow through cuts. They caused damage to the tree. Those wall four will never close over. Or we make flush cuts that removes the collar. So just make sure you got the right tools for the job. And if you don't, just let the tree do its thing. That's something that we see all too much. So that brings us to the end. I guess we are a little bit early. I don't know how we got through it that fast, but I'm happy to answer questions and hopefully it was helpful.
Thanks, Jason. It was very helpful. I enjoyed it very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking your time. It's pretty dry and boring.
I love it. It was great.
Okay, I think there's a chat thing here, but I can't get to it. I'm having serious problems with opening things. There we go. Super helpful. Thanks very much. Yeah, anybody, you guys are really welcome to email me. There's my email on the screen. I don't claim to know everything at all. I'm just trying to learn like you guys are. And I'd love to share my experience, and I have taken this test in the BCMA, and but gosh, it's a changing industry. So we got to be able to share information.
Try to leave a moment for folks that would like to ask a question, but just thanks, Jason. This has been great.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate you guys hearing me out. Any questions at all? I'm happy to answer about anything pertaining to anything with tree work. I'm here, so I don't know how we got done 15 minutes early. That was really, I guess I talked too fast.
No, I love the pictures. It was hands-on, good information. So just thank you. And I guess we're done for tonight then. And it will be recorded and be out to you in the morning by Kelly. And we have one more session. So just, actually, I'm gonna go for a minute. Don't forget to pat yourselves on the back. 3/4 of the way done, and good reading and a little bit more to do. We'll see y'all next week with Dana Coelho, I think, to finish her out.
It looks like
So thanks, Jason.
somebody may have a question. I just see a Lindsay says a quick question, Jason. So if you want to keep it on for a minute and see if she speaks up, I'm all ears.
I guess my question is dealing with the turf management with your trees in the turf. Not to throw anybody under the bus, but I have a boss who I cannot seem to convince that the overwatering of our trees in irrigated areas matters a little bit more than his grass.
Okay.
We've lost in one area, we've lost 4 trees just due to overwatering.
Mhm.
It's saturated all the time. And I don't know, how do you navigating conversations like that with
Yeah.
someone who, I mean, I've only been in my position for 2 years, and I don't know if it's just lack of credibility or what it is that he just curious.
Yeah, no, I deal with this all the time. And so in our business, we do an extensive plant healthcare business, right? And we manage for a lot of landscapers. So we often are in the position of a landscaper has us on plant healthcare. And we show up and the homeowner's there and they're overwatering, right? So we have to be tactful about this. And that's the answer, right? Meet people where they are, don't insult them. And, you know, it's the thing is, you can use a variety of tools, and you got, you know, these probes. Just look up a soil probe, and I don't have one right handy. I have a bunch in the shop, but they're just a metal thing. You stick it in the ground and you can see how deep that's going down. You know, you're wasting water and it's never drying out, and you can stick that in and say, look, we can. And so the things you need to touch on are that duration and frequency, right? And say, and the other thing I often will do when the trees are doing poorly time and time again, you can go up and move that tree in the ground, right? So if that tree is, you grab that stem and it's moving around, you know it has a poorly developed root system. And so I explain it to people and such that, you know, this is the way. There's a lot of politically good ways to say this, and it's the trees. Your landscape was installed and we had to water it like crazy because these young trees were establishing or trying to grow grass. But as it's evolved, we understand drainage characteristics and everything else. And now we feel like we need to adjust duration and frequency. And so ultimately you can have even nicer turf too, because if it's insaturated, it's not going to like it. Your soil is going to compact more. You're going to have more problems with fungus and everything else. So by just dialing in on these things, can we get this thing back to where our duration and frequency is managed a little better? And it's like, let's water for a little bit less or a lot less. And maybe one day a week, we can give you that big soaker. And you can also tell them that, you know, your turf will become a little bit stronger if we can slightly stress it in between waterings, because it's going to have a stronger root system. So there's all these reasons for doing this that aren't just the trees, but ultimately the trees are the biggest asset value. You put the most money into it, yet it's being overlooked over turf. So the other thing is those heavy saturated soils, you know, especially if they're in a park or an open space, you're really exacerbating that foot traffic issues that you get with your turf quality being poor down the road. So, you know, like you can just meet him where he's at and say, I understand why we set these things here, but I'm seeing this landscape evolve into where we start to need to make just some corrections. We can just mess with two things: how often we water and how long we run the cycle. Let's just play with it. Let me play with it a little bit. If the turf starts to get a little dry looking, we'll just go back. But you know, these are the things you got to do. But that soil probe and moving the tree around are the go-tos for me to be like, yeah, might be just giving a little too much, or maybe it's draining poorly, or maybe the cycle's running too long on this one day of the week. Can I look into it? And then you'll get buy-in. I mean, that's what I find.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You know, I have a comment on that too. Sometimes, you know, if that person finding who they actually listen to, sometimes it's the customer or the board, or, you know, just having the information come from the extension fact sheet that's from the university. You know, those kind of are coming from perhaps areas that might be more conducive to who he or she would be paying attention to. So it's, you know, sometimes we're all tree voices, right? And I'm sure Jason, you are too. We speak for the trees, and sometimes you just have to, you know, they're not always going to be receptive. So just looking for different avenues.
Yep, agreed. But just, you know, trying not to, it's hard with people that just think about turf, but you can meet them where they are and not insult
Yeah,
them.
meet them where they are too, and actually listen. Sometimes they just want to be heard, and then they'll listen. So.
And there was a typo on my, it's my aspen tree. I left an A out in there. Somebody just made a note on that on the chat. So if you want my email address, it's Jason@myaspentree, not Spen. I don't know where the A went. So awesome. Well, that was great. Thank you guys for letting me share that with you. And please let me know if I could help anyone anymore, anytime.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jason. I'll shut her down.